It's the PhD weekly blog, week 24. So I missed week 23. It's been a hectic couple of weeks. Main reason for that being the Summer Institute for Computational Social Sciences. The same thing I was attending in the last video. We had 2 full weeks of that. Extremely valuable experience. Very privileged to have been selected to participate in that. Very, very interesting. Learned a lot out of it. Main things out of that were several useful tools, model context protocol, which is or MCP, which is a complicated way of saying that you attach a tool. It's a protocol whereby you attach a framework or a tool to the side of an LLM or potentially Gen AI, sorry, a Gen AI, or potentially an agentic AI or part of an agentic AI, in order to compel it to funnel its thinking through that framework, which, as you can imagine, perfect for an ethical framework. If you want it to stick to that framework, it has to using this method. So this is going to be pretty ideal for me. Retrieval augmented generation, or RAG, which is basically a different method whereby it's compelled to source all of its information, not from its training data, which is, the entire training online experience, but from the documentation that you specify. Naturally, that's a far, far less powerful tool, but it is nonetheless extraordinarily specific. Not sure if it has a role with my work yet. May be useful if we're looking to get specific outcomes from specific documents. For example, if I wanted it to come up with a analysis of or a compilation of all of the different ethical codes that exist, rather than just telling it to run rampant, where it's going to pick up a whole bunch of nonsense off the internet, a lot of corporate mess. Instead, I could give it ones that I know are good and tell it to analyze those, only those, which means that whatever comes out is going to be of a much higher relevance and quality. The AI and Ethics Journal, that's a thing that exists. That's good to know. Validation approaches, this is not new, but this is sort of like, how do you determine whether or not the analysis conducted by the AI is correct? What I'm finding, and one of the major outputs of the SICSS workshop last 2 weeks, was that it's not very well done, where it's done at all. It's not to say there isn't significant effort undertaking there, but it's a new and emergent sphere. And so there's a lot of weird stuff happening just because it works, sort of, but there's no way of validating whether it works or not yet. So does it work? We don't know. I'll give an example of that in a second. Social bias management, not a new concept for ethics at least. Care and fair ethical frameworks are unfortunately prime examples of exactly what I was talking about this not being done particularly well. Fair and care are acronyms, which means that they're virtue ethics, which means that they're a waste of time. Sorry, I know that sounds cynical, but from a professional ethics point of view, the number of times I've seen virtue ethics used functionally or successfully in a professional setting or an academic setting for that is zero. They're marketing most of the time, or just sort of comfort words, shall we say. I'm not saying anyone's doing misconduct or anything like that. I'm just saying if this is the best we have so far, and it usually is where everything starts with ethics, it's not very good. So, managing false positives and negatives. This is going to be critical. False positives is when the targeting algorithm or the threshold for the ethical threshold we're setting for the AI to run through incorrectly identifies a bigot or a neo-Nazi or whoever we're going to target, and delivers consequences when they aren't one part of the target sample. This is obviously a severe problem for us, which is why I want such a high threshold. False negatives, on the other hand, is where you miss one. That's more acceptable because we're going for a pre-bunking sort of approach, which minimizes the harm. So you miss one Nazi, it's probably not that big of a deal. It's more of accidentally wrapping people up. Then again, the pre-bunking approach we're talking about using is pretty low impact, since really it's just sort of debunking key points rather than banning them, for example. So even if you did wrap up people that weren't technically neo-Nazis, it wouldn't really hurt anyone. Irritate people, potentially have a backfire effect, but will mitigate that. So, there's a whole thing about computational social science has a theory gap. That's been pretty fascinating to learn. The thing, it's a weird one to conceptualize, so bear with me on this. Basically, because computational social science is a new field, or more accurately, a combination of the computational sciences and the social sciences, which is what AI functionally is, because it's a language model and therefore it needs to be trained using sociological concepts, but also fundamentally based on programming. It's a new field. which means there is no theory for it. Or, thinking about it another way, there's two times as much theory for it, just none of it speaks to each other. One of the biggest problems with academia is they've got all these different schools inside the university. They never talk to each other. I know that's an exaggeration in an extreme case, but like collaborations are the exception, not the norm. Something I found particularly hilarious back when my undergraduate, when I was learning environmental management, and they had an economics class for us. Who taught the economics class inside the environmental management school? An environmental management person, a social scientist. Meanwhile, you got the School of Economics right there. Who's teaching the environmental or the environmental or triple bottom lining or the other environmentally aligned or genuine progress indicator instead of a GDP. Who's teaching it over there? Well, no one, for starters, because they don't respect those concepts. And two, there's just absolutely no collaboration. You know, you could probably solve 90% of the problems if you just took the social science elements and forced the economists to learn them, since that's basically what you end up doing as an environmental manager anyway. But point stands. In other words, it's a formative space, which means gaps, which means problems. I need to learn how to program in R. They gave us a little experiment to try, and it was meant to be a step-by-step easy one. And it was one of those classic scenarios where it was like, if you do A, then you get B. And I'm like, uh-huh. Then B to C, and I'm like, uh-huh. And then C to quark, and I'm like, what? And then quark the flabble. And I'm like, what the fuck just happened? Like, completely fell apart in the steps, not to mention that the programs didn't run properly because different software hadn't been downloaded. Anyway, you always love it when someone turns around to you and goes, oh, this is a known problem with Windows 10. Just Google it. Yeah, I'll get right on that. I know what I'm doing. Yeah, this is going to go great. Anyway, people forget that they know things that other people don't have the basis in, so which is me. Hi. So hence the fact I needed to learn how to program in R, so I'm going to have to do some sort of summer school or something like that. Okay. Oh, personas. Oh, this was a fun one. Talking about a lack of theory and a lack of validation inside the computational social sciences. Let me run this one past you. There is a technique, very useful technique, whereby you train an LLM or a agentic AI or just an AI. You train an AI to pretend to be a person that represents a demographic or a user, right? So by doing this, you train one agent to behave in this way and only behave in this way, and then you get that persona to interact with the tool you're trying to create as part of a training process. So rather than having to source a neo-Nazi and, you know, reliably get them to feed data, instead you create a neo-Nazi based on neo-Nazi behaviors online and profiles and so forth, and then you get the fake neo-Nazi to talk to the tool as a means of training it. You can see the value of that, right? Like very, very effective. It's also data falsification. You've taken statistics, you've taken quantitative data, and you've taught a machine to pretend to be a person based on that and develop qualitative data based on experiences it's never had drawn from that quantitative data. At which point you're falsifying qualitative data out of the quantitative data. There's literally no different than if I pretended to be the neo-Nazi and just talked to the machine, which would definitely be not okay. So that's a gap. All my red flags went off with that one. And it gets worse because here's the thing. The example they gave us was pretend to be a mother in Ireland, an Irish mother aged between 30 and 50, leaning conservative politically. You know what that is when you get a computer to develop a persona based on that? That's an ethnic stereotype. That's what that is. Here's a individual personality that we've constructed based on quantitative demographic data. That's an ethnic stereotype. You want my illustration? Imagine what you get it to do if you asked it to, please build me a persona based on a low-income African American person who lives in the Bronx. Guess what you're going to get out of that? Is it going to? And here's the thing, if it's not a racy caricature, why not? What data are you basing it on? Whole thing is disgusting and deeply problematic, and no one seems to have picked up on that yet. And as the designated pain in everyone's ass, it falls to me. So I'm gonna have some issues with that. It's sort of is a case of the perfect being the enemy, the good. But on the other hand, I'm not really sure how this can even be described as good, so much as just convenient. So we're gonna have to do something about that. I think that might be a separate paper at a later stage. Anyway, so beyond that, I've done a little bit of literature review recently and come across gradient responsibility networks, which is a bit of research. Okay, I'll put a link into the description, but what was the name of the researcher? Bear with me for while this bloody thing loads. Um, why is it? Oh yeah, there we are. Is Kwan Hong Tan from Singapore University of Social Sciences, adjunct over there. Excellent theory. Basically, what they've constructed here is an elaboration on an old theory I developed ages and ages ago. I had never published, so let's not try and take credit here. They used to call it Beyond Singer's Pond. Singer's Pond, the whole concept, famous ethicist Peter Singer talking about you're seeing a kid drowning in a pond, you can go in, but it'll destroy your lovely jacket, right? Trying to do a utilitarian calculation of the situation and then extend that out to animal rights or social welfare and international aid and that sort of concept. Obviously, you should destroy the jacket to save the child, and then using that as a metaphor. My exaggeration on that or extrapolation on that was, all right, well, what if you're one of 10 people watching a kid drown? Any one of you could save the kid. If none of you do, are you all 10% responsible for the death of the child? What's 10% of a death? What does that mean? Illustrating thereby that responsibility isn't can't be calculated like fractions. It doesn't work, right? And the same concept can be extrapolated out. What adjunct professor Tan has come up with is a more detailed extrapolation of that specifically for AI, looking at causal contribution factors, foreseeability factors, intentionality factors, mitigation effort factors, i.e., could they have intervened to prevent it, problems and emergent behavior modifiers. And there's also a temporal factor built in there because these things tend to change over time. And the idea is to be able to map out the responsibility of all of the different parties involved in an AI's development and implementation and use over a period of time, leading to an outcome, right? So if there's a serious data breach or invasion of privacy or misfire of the AI completely, how do you map out the responsibility for this over a period of time, right? Very good. One problem, none of those factors are defined, which means that ultimately the professors attempted to put them on a scale between 0 and 1 or, just yes and no, 100% and 0%, whatever. And ultimately lacking any measurement factor for that or methodology. It pretty much just comes down to their subjective opinion. So, in other words, it's a very complicated way of measuring the professor's personal opinion on something. It's better than nothing, or more to the point, it's a starting point. I think breaking down these factors is extremely valuable, but we're going to have to find a better way of measuring them. Fortunately, that's the sort of thing that social science should be able to do, apart from intentionality factor, because that's absolutely immeasurable, not to mention kind of irrelevant. Hot take on that one for the non-ethicists watching this, assuming anyone ever gets this deep. Your intentions don't matter when it comes to ethics. Whether or not you intended to run over 10 people with your car or whether you did it accidentally, you still got 10 dead people. That's the problem. Your intent is relevant, but only insofar as determining what to do with you now, right? It doesn't change the fact that the consequences are the consequences. But it can tell us whether you're likely to do it again. If you did it intentionally, probably at risk of doing it a second time. If you did it accidentally, well, less of a chance of doing it again, probably enough punishment already, to be honest, just by knowing it. The problem also with intentionality is that you can never tell. People lie. People don't even necessarily know what their own intentions were. So, like, I mean, it's a mess. You're never going to get any clarity on that unless you come across a signed and dated confession before the fact of the person saying, of sound, mind, and body, hereby declare that I intended to run over 10 people with my car. You're never going to be able to provide any sort of proof. And that sort of orgy of evidence just simply doesn't happen, right? So, That one's going to be handy, specifically because there's going to be two halves to this ethical framework as I'm beginning to think about it. First, you've got your targeting algorithm. Who is unethical? What is the threshold for that? Time, place, etc. Second is going to be the governance of the people doing the intervening or using the AI to make sure that even if you've got the right target, it deploys correctly and you are accountable for its deployment. Critical, absolutely critical, and the thing, sort of thing that tends to get overlooked. So this gradient responsibility network, or GRN, will be incredibly useful because it will allow us to map out the responsibility of the different parties over time. Assuming we want to get that deep into it, but I'm not seeing a lot of reason not to, and it's a nice nod to the professors, the adjunct professors' work. Anyway, I've reached out to them. They've replied. I've given them my questions. I have not heard back. It's probably not that surprising, but it is. Professor, if you're watching this by some absolute miracle, please respond. I'm very impressed by your work. It needs some extra work, but we'll get there. We'll do it. What else? Okay, so here's the big one. Probably should lead with this, but it's too late now. I'm not redoing this video for a fourth time. Yes, a fourth time. Anyway, I'm tired. I don't know if that's obvious yet, but yeah, in the last 2 weeks have been pretty hectic. So I'm still on the recovery a little bit. Commencement is now official. It is coming up on early September, latest early September. That's good. Gives me a month. So first things first, need to clarify the research questions. Sat down with Matteo, my supervisor, who got back last week. We've reviewed it. I found a few examples of agentic AI and CVE, counter-violent extremism work. So we do know that it is indeed viable and likely to be the wave of the future. So that's good. We did have a little bit of reflection that maybe we've gone a little bit too specific now because, as it turns out, agentic AI is not fundamentally different from AI in general. So why limit ourselves? Though we should address it specifically. Not necessary to focus on any given extremist group because, being a good ethical principle or ethical framework, the principle should be universalizable. We're not targeting Nazis, it's just that they happen to qualify as extremists, right? And then we can use them as a case study within the study, but the research question shouldn't be that exclusive. Platforms, the same thing. We probably don't need to be specific to a given platform. It should be universalizable across any publicly facing um, social media platform. Private stuff's never going to work. We don't have access to that. Shouldn't probably have access to that. And as I've said in previous videos, I don't really care. If the neo-Nazis dive underground, good. Makes it harder for them to recruit. That's kind of the point. And ultimately, we were never going to solve the problem wholesale through anything I can do. That needs to be solved by rebuilding the social contract and or going after the people running these groups. But we'll get there eventually. Anyway, that's a problem for another day. So, got to finish that, and then we're going to put forward all the paperwork for the confirmation. Matteo's going to look into the panel, and I will brief my supervisory panel as well, which is a separate group, conflicts of interest and whatnot. So, yeah, it is coming together. Feeling good about it, feeling empowered, feeling wildly more skilled every week, which is pretty goddamn excellent. So, yeah, we are making progress, and that will do for this week. I will be back on a regular schedule every week from now on. Apart from 1 week in August, I must admit, because I'm going to be heading over to Perth, and there's just zero chance of me doing any work while I'm there. So, yeah, here we are.